you will learn about the 3 data types in Python. We have numbers, strings, and booleans. Now there are times you want to convert the value of the variable from one type to another. Let me show you. So we will use the input function to read the user's birth year. So enter the birth year. Now this input function is going to return a value, so we can store it in a variable called birth_year. Now let's write a code to calculate the age of this user, so we write an expression like this. Currently, we are in the year of 2025, so 2025 minus birth_year. This expression or piece of code is going to produce a value. So once again, we can store that value in a variable. Let's call that variable age and let's print age on the terminal. Let's run the program and see what happens. So my birth year is 2001, and the program would crash. So whenever you see this error red message, so this error occurred in this file that is our app.py on line 2. Right below that we can see the piece of code that generated this error. So that is this expression 2025 minus birth year, but below that we can see the type of error. We can see unsupported types for subtraction. We have int and str. Int is short for integer, and that represents a whole number in programming. So 2025 is an example of an integer. Now birth year is an example for a string. Because whenever we call the input function, this function would return a value as a string, even if we enter a number. In other words, when I entered 2001, this input function returned a string with these characters 2001. So this string is different from the string 2001. They are completely different types. So in this case, we don't need these lines. The reason we got this error is because we tried to subtract a string from an integer. So our code looks like this 2001. Now Python does not know how to subtract a string from an integer. So to solve this problem, we need to convert this string to an integer. Now in Python, we have a bunch of built-in functions for converting the types of our variables. So we have this int function, we can pass our birth year to it. And this will return the representation of the birth year. So to solve this problem, we need to replace the string with the int function. So let's see, what is going on here? On the first line, we called the input function. This returns a string. On the second line, we pass the string to our int function, and the int function will return a numeric representation of the birth year. Then we subtract it from 2025 and store it in the age of the variable. Now let's start our program. So 2001, and there you go. I am 24 years old. So this is how the int function works. We also have another built-in function called float. That is for converting a value to a floating point number. A floating point number in Python and other programming languages is a number with a decimal point. So 10 is an integer, and 10.1 is a float. So we have int, we have float, And we also have bool for converting a value to Boolean. And finally, we have str to convert a value to a string. So these are the built-in functions for converting the type of our variables. Now here's a little exercise for you. I want you to write a basic calculator program. So here we have to enter two numbers. We can type a whole number or a number with a decimal point. And then our program will print the sum of these two numbers. So pause this video and spend a few minutes on this exercise and then see my solution. All right, first we are going to call our input function to read the first number. We get the result and store it in a variable called first. Now let's declare another variable called second and read the second number. Yeah, now we calculate the sum. So that is first plus second. Now let's see what happens when we print the sum on the terminal. So I entered 10 and 20, but instead of 30, we get 10, 20. This is because we are combining or concatenating two strings. So as I told you before, the input function returns a string. So this line is going to be equivalent to first equals to 10. We are dealing with a string, not an integer. Similarly, second is going to be 20 as a string. So when we combine two strings, 10 equals 20, we will get 1020 because we are dealing with textual data. So to solve this problem, we need to convert the values to their numeric representation. So over here, we are going to pass first to our int function. And here as well. Now let's run our program and enter 10 and 20. We get 30. What if we enter a floating point number? So 10.1 and 20. We got an error. So to solve this problem, we need to treat both these variables as floats. So instead of the int function, we will use the float function. Now let's run our program one more time. We enter a whole number and a floating point number. So the result is correct. Now let's add a label over here. So sum is plus sum. Let's run our program one more time. 10 and 20, once again, we get an error. The error is saying that Python can only concentrate on one string, not floats to strings. So on line 4, we have a string. We are concatenating this with a float because the result of this expression is a floating point number. We are adding two floats. So the result is a float as well. So Python doesn't know how to evaluate a code like this. It does not know how to concatenate a float to a string. To solve this problem, we need to convert sum to str. Now let's run the program again. So 10 plus 20.1, and here is the result. Now, one last thing. In this example, I am calling the float function at the time we want to calculate the sum of these two numbers. But this is not the requirement. we can call the float function over here. So this input function returns a string. We can pass that string to our float function. Take a look. So float parentheses like this. So the value we are passing to the float function is the value that is returned to the input function. Similarly, we call the float function over here now. We can change this expression to first plus second. This is another way to write this piece of code. So type conversion is important in Python and other programming languages. There are times you need to convert the type of variable to a different type.